bombas.
Mr. Ульянов, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. I would like to start with the initiatives that have been proposed since the beginning of the year. Can you outline some of them?
My career as a UN diplomat began during Perestroika, when the USSR still existed. Back then, the Soviet Union always proposed and actively promoted a key initiative ahead of every General Assembly. It was done every year. We have stopped that practice because we don't want to come up with initiatives just for the sake of the initiatives. Of course, we prepare them, and some of them are long-term, like developing the Convention on countering the use of information and communication technologies for criminal purposes. It is our initiative that is being discussed. The first negotiation session has just ended. It wasn't easy, but the process is underway. As for this year, we've only had 3 weeks of working days so far, but what I can share with you is that a few Middle Eastern countries have asked us to organize events that would support the conference on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. We've been involved in working on that initiative. It is going to take a month or a month and a half to prepare it. Things are going well so far. We'll see. That's what I can share with you for now. Maybe one more thing. We feel like it's necessary to make coordination between like-minded countries more efficient. There is a long list of countries that share Russia's stance on international affairs. We communicate with them, but I think we could do better in that respect. We are currently discussing ways to improve that here in Vienna.
How has the work of international organizations changed since the beginning of the military operation in Ukraine? How biased are they?
To some extent, there has always been bias. Now there is significantly more of that. This is not a healthy situation. We really feel it here in Vienna. For 40 years, the so-called Vienna spirit, the spirit of partnership and consensus, has been prevalent here. Now it has disappeared completely, and that is our new reality which we must navigate, finding new ways to work and communicate. So yes, there is bias, and it is quite obvious.
If we talk about nuclear security, is some kind of dialogue with the West possible there? Is any type of dialogue with the West possible right now?
When you said nuclear security, I immediately thought about my field, my area of expertise. The International Atomic Energy Agency has its own mission. It's not really about the strategic relations between great powers. Our objective is to ensure the safety of nuclear sites, like nuclear power stations and so on. If I understand correctly, you want to know about strategic relations. This cooperation is at an extremely low point right now. New START is still valid, but we don't expect any new treaties to be signed in this context. It's unrealistic. In order to revive the dialogue, the US would have to adjust their course significantly. Right now, their actions are hostile towards Russia.
What's the solution?
I wish I knew. Time will tell.
Can you tell us about the nuclear security at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant? We know about the IAEA's involvement. How effective has this involvement been? We know that the plant has come under fire a few times despite the presence of international experts. Why is it so hard to set up a protection zone there?
We invited IAEA experts to the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, hoping that they would be able to get a more objective view on what's happening there. That mission hasn't been successful. In our opinion, the November report, which summed up the first 2 months of the IAEA presence at the plant, was biased. We shared that in public and in our private conversations with the IAEA Secretariat. Let's see what they say in their February report that should be ready before the Board of Governors meeting in March. Our second objective was to bring international experts there so that the Ukrainians would stop firing in the direction of the nuclear plant. That was our hope. It didn't happen at first, but in the last few months, since November 20th, there haven't been any incidents of Ukrainians shooting at the plant directly. I guess several factors played a role here, including the presence of the agency employees. As for the failure to set up a protection zone, there's one main reason why it's not happening. The Ukrainians are not ready to embrace the proposals made by the agency's Director General Rafael Grossi. It's been almost 5 months since the proposal was handed over to Russia and Ukraine. We voiced our reactions and suggested certain adjustments, while the Ukrainians haven't said anything specific yet.
Why do you think they're doing this?
I assume they have other priorities. They don't want to have their hands tied in terms of firing at the nuclear facility. I wouldn't rule this out, especially now that the IAEA officials present there are not authorized to say who is responsible for the firing that took place. We saw this happen in the autumn, in August. It's not in the IAEA's mandate, and the Ukrainians took advantage of that in the autumn.
As for the negative consequences of the Ukrainian conflict, we see Europe trying to wean itself off its dependence on Russian energy. How do you assess Russia's prospects of resuming partnership with the European countries in the energy sector?
I don't think the kind of partnership we used to have is possible, at least in the foreseeable future. Part of the Russian energy supply contracts will remain, of course, at least for some time, but the scale is different, as is the efficiency level. However, this was an informed choice made by the European countries. It's their right.
Did I get you right that once the war is over, and we do hope that this will happen sooner rather than later, things won't be getting back to the pre-conflict levels? That Europe has successfully replaced Russia as its main gas supplier and is going to stay that way?
Very much so, apparently. I'm talking about my personal perceptions here. I can be wrong. However, the European energy sector will never be self-sufficient. So what they are really looking at now is replacing their dependence on Russia with a dependence on other energy suppliers. It's pretty much irrational. Instead of purchasing cheap Russian gas, they are now paying for American liquefied natural gas, which is several times more expensive. This makes me think of a well-known Russian joke about a boy who chose to have his ears frostbitten just to vex his grandma. That's exactly what is happening now. Let me tell you that, starting from January the 1st, our electricity bill here in Vienna has tripled compared to last year, and our chief accountant expects it to reach a 7-digit figure in euros by the end of the year. So these policies have extremely negative consequences for Europe and its economy. But, I'll repeat, they consciously chose this option, even if letting your economic interests be dominated by ill-conceived political plans to that extent is completely irrational.
To what extent have the Europeans become self-sufficient in terms of energy supplies? Once Russia was slapped with sanctions, they had to look for other options and managed to replace their dependence on Russia by buying energy from other countries. As a result, energy bills are skyrocketing, as you said. The US can't have been unaware of all these repercussions, but even knowing that the European friends would suffer didn't stop them from doing this, right? However, the sanctions did help Europe to become more self-sufficient in terms of energy, don't you think?
No, they've become less dependent on Russian supplies, but they still retain their dependency on energy supplies from other countries, including the US. Moreover, the terms are far less favorable for them now.
But the US is getting a lot of money for these supplies.
The US was the only country that benefited from World War II, by the way, for a number of reasons. While the Soviet Union and Europe were devastated by that war, the US, on the contrary, made a huge leap forward economically.
Do you think that's what the US had in mind when the sanctions were discussed? I mean that they'll be earning more money by supplying more gas to Europe after Russia has been sanctioned. Do you think that this was the plan?
I've dealt a lot with economic sanctions in my work, even if only within the US system. I can tell you that the Americans have a lot of expertise and experience as far as sanctions are concerned. I think it was all in their plan. There was only one miscalculation. It was the first time that sanctions were introduced against a big and powerful country such as Russia, and it has turned out they don't actually work the way the West expected them to. The sanctions create problems for Russia, of course, but at the same time, they boost growth and force Russia to rely more on its potential. Russia's year-end economic indicators look quite decent, actually. The West's intention to crush the Russian economy failed, and they admitted themselves.
Why do you think the West has failed to seriously harm Russia? Is it because of Russia's pivot towards China and other countries like India and Pakistan?
It was one of the factors. Let me say this again. Sanctions used to be imposed on small or medium-sized countries and were more effective. For example, there were sweeping sanctions slapped on the former Yugoslavia, just like on Iraq under Saddam Hussein, which led to disastrous consequences. Russia is too big. We have a lot of potential in many areas. We were able to pivot quickly from the West to the East in a number of spheres. The government made some management decisions. All these factors allowed us to resist the pressure of sanctions throughout the previous year with dignity, while achieving decent results.
What was your role in that? Could you dwell on how you contributed?
I wasn't talking about our role, I was talking about the Russian Federation as a whole. Results are the ultimate proof, and the results, as I said before, are by far less catastrophic than what the West expected. It is entirely possible that when all calculations are made, it will turn out that these sanctions hit Europe harder than Russia in the medium term.
On what terms do you think it would be possible to normalize relations between Russia and the West in the future? And is that even possible given the current situation?
As someone who was trained as a historian, I know that crises and conflicts sooner or later come to an end and relations are restored to a significant degree. Any textbook on world history will tell you that. The same will probably happen now. It's difficult to say what these relations will look like, but we are not going back to the status quo, that's for sure. It's not going to be business as usual, it will be something else. But it's true that we were forced to reconsider some of our core attitudes to the West significantly.
What little trust there was is now certainly gone. But what else will change? What else can you say about the new nature of these future relations?
You know, I could probably answer your question if I had a crystal ball, but I'm afraid no one, no politician could give you an accurate forecast. It will depend on a myriad of factors. New governments with new approaches will come to power in the West. Consequently, we may have a less negative view of them. Shared economic interests will come into play, but right now, all this is like trying to read tea leaves. Nobody can tell you how the situation will unfold.
Another topic I'd like to discuss with you, going back to nuclear security, is the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. What's the status of the plan these days?
Simply put, it looks like a dead end. At the same time, in the last few days, there have been signals showing that it might be possible to finalize the deal. There have been some leaks indicating that the Americans reached out to Iran via Qatar with some proposals related to the nuclear deal, although probably indirectly, as Qatar's foreign minister said in Tehran. There are signals that seem to indicate that the Americans are hoping for a direct line of communication with Iran, and there have been no direct contacts between them up till now. So there's something going on, but we've yet to see if these developments lead anywhere. All I can say is that there's no reasonable alternative to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. All other options are worse, and the only difference between them is how negative they are. That's why we're in favor of completing the Vienna talks, which, on the whole, were very successful and which essentially allowed us to come up with an agreement. There are only perhaps a few lines left to sort out, and the deal will be ready, so that it could translate into a decision to go back to the situation before Trump's maximum pressure campaign. Iran's nuclear program will develop backwards. What I mean is that from the current extremely advanced stage, it will go back to the parameters negotiated in 2015. At the same time, the US will lift its sanctions from Iran. This is the best way forward.
Lately, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken toured the Middle East. As Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen toured Africa. We're seeing many high-level meetings with top US officials in Africa and the Middle East, with the Egyptian foreign minister and so on. What do you think about the timing of that? Is it an attempt to touch base and double-check that all these countries are still friends of the US?
I guess so, but this isn't a new development. US officials have always toured different regions.
Do you think it's connected to the military operation, or are the tensions growing behind the scenes, so everyone has embarked on these big tours to check on the relations?
Certainly, all powers involved in the current challenging situation, including Washington and Moscow, want to know the current state of global affairs. Actually, this state clearly manifests in the international organizations that include those powers. For now, I don't see anything extraordinary in what you've mentioned. This is normal operation. Our foreign minister has also visited several African nations recently. Africa is our major partner, and we need to maintain our ties with the continent. We are also working on that here in Vienna. We partner closely with the African Union and its major members like Egypt and South Africa. We have good coordination and cooperation.
Is it a battle for Africa and its resources? A race to get there first and make agreements to extract its reserves? Do you feel it in your work, or is it business as usual and the military operation hasn't changed anything?
We don't feel it in Vienna. If we are talking about the media, I would agree with you. But I've also been to Africa recently, which shows the EU is ready to compete for African markets, as well as the US and China. China's been there for quite a while, and it's enjoyed a lot of success. Again, I don't see anything exceptional. The background has changed, and it definitely impacts the actions of all players, but there were no radical shifts. Long term, Asia, Africa and Latin America will be the priorities of the Russian foreign agenda, and the role of the EU, the US and Canada will gradually dwindle.
You also mentioned the degradation of the West. What did you mean by that?
I meant the degradation not of the West itself, but its foreign policy. The quality has dropped dramatically, it's become extremely ideology-driven. Russophobia has become one of its ideology's key features. In the end, what we have to deal with is unbelievable. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. A few days ago, Finland's foreign minister, a high-ranking official, expressed an opinion that Russia was behind the burnings of Qurans in Sweden and Denmark. Statements like that delivered by a minister are anything but smart. I'd call it something completely different. And here's an example from Vienna's international institutions. It's not a secret that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was shelled by Ukrainian and not Russian forces. Still, over the last year, Canada, first together with Poland, and when it left the Board of Governors with Finland, has 3 times adopted resolutions urging Russia to end some kind of actions against nuclear facilities in Ukraine. And we know that it was Ukraine that shelled the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It's a well-known fact, even though Ukraine maintains it was Russia that fired at its own forces. During the board's meetings, I tried to get an explanation from our former partners about what exactly did they mean by urging us to end actions against the power plant more than once. And they couldn't give a solid answer despite unanimously voting for those resolutions. It could have happened in the times of the Cold War. The interactions were limited, but professional. There probably were some fluctuations, but what we face today is sometimes beyond the reach of reason. You can't make it up.
So how do you maintain a dialogue if they don't listen to us? It's like we're speaking different languages.
Quite so. We are living in parallel realities. The fact that we don't have much contacts helps a little, I guess. We mostly keep to ourselves, but when we need to talk, me and our Western partners never turn each other down. But it happens much less frequently than 12 or 18 months ago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ulyanov. Thank you for your time.